Hi there. I just wanted to share a couple of fun facts I've learned from medical school in the past few weeks. I'm in my last module of second year, which is didactic, the last didactic year, where we're like learning what we need to know to practice medicine. And then the last 2 years, we work in the clinic and actually practice what we learned. But I'm in my reproductive module, and last module was endocrine, and I learned a lot about hormones. I'm still learning a lot about hormones and stuff. One thing I found really interesting and that a lot of people don't necessarily know or are misinformed about is that even though physical activity can't spot reduce fat, there are certain things that can influence your hormonal profile, like lifestyle things you can do that can actually help spot reduce fat from the abdominal region. So for example, insulin preferentially targets visceral abdominal fat. So if you eat a lot of sugar, and glucose is the #1 trigger for insulin secretion into your blood. Insulin is secreted by the pancreas, and if you consume sugar, or glucose is the scientific term for simple sugar, then your pancreas will secrete insulin, and insulin targets fat cells in your belly and tells them to take up energy, basically. And then they store more fat, so you store more abdominal visceral fat if you eat like a high carb, high sugar diet. That's not to say you should completely take carbs out of your diet though, because cortisol is also bad if you want to spot reduce fat from your abdomen. Cortisol is a stress hormone secreted when you're stressed, obviously, but also when you are on like a low carb diet, like keto diet. I believe, let me double check that, but let me ask ChatGPT. Does a low carb diet increase cortisol production? Yes, a low carb diet can lead to an increase in cortisol production, particularly in the short term, or when carb intake is very low or chronically restricted. So because glucose scarcity is a stress signal, so if you completely cut carbs out of your diet, then you're going to have higher baseline levels of cortisol, which also preferentially targets fat cells. So my recommendation as a medical student, so don't quote me on this, I could be totally off base. My recommendation is to reduce carbohydrate intake, especially simple sugars, but still eat like a moderate amount of healthy, slow digesting carbs like oatmeal, whole wheat bread, brown rice, things like that. Vegetables, of course, fruit, all of these things. And then to also incorporate things in your diet that slow down the insulin response. So cinnamon buffers the insulin response to glucose, and then also I believe vinegar does. And then eating vegetables before you eat like the rest of your food also buffers the insulin response or the glucose, the blood sugar spike. Things like that. Another thing that can help is going on walks immediately after you eat, because there are glucose transporters. The way insulin works is it upregulates these things called GLUT transporters in your cells, and those transporters basically transport glucose into your cells. So that's how insulin works. A lot of cells are insulin dependent, but some cells don't need insulin to upregulate, like GLUT4 transporters, for example, muscle cells. If you contract my PS5 is turning off. If you contract your muscles, like when you're walking or whatever, then that automatically upregulates your GLUT4 receptors, and then it helps reduce the blood glucose spike, and also thereby decreases insulin secretion from the pancreas, because you don't have as much glucose circulating in your blood. So your pancreas says, oh, I don't need to worry about secreting a bunch of insulin anymore. And like I said before, insulin preferentially targets abdominal fat cells, so having a lower level of insulin is better if you want to spot reduce belly fat. I'm trying to think if I learned anything else that could be useful. Also, sleep. Sleep is really important for hormonal regulation, because growth hormone is secreted in your sleep, specifically in like the second hour of sleep is when you have the biggest burst of growth hormone release. And growth hormone, you might hear of like athletes and bodybuilders using it because it's a really unique hormone in that it builds muscle and breaks down fat. So sleep is really good if you want to build muscle and break down fat. It's when you burn most of your fat and you build most of your muscle. It seems intuitive, but hearing the science behind it kind of helps me like understand the importance a little bit better of sleep. And then finally, this is something I was guilty of in the past. I did not incorporate enough dietary fat into my diet. And in endocrinology, we learned a lot about how fats help improve satiety during a meal. If you have a really low fat diet, then you might not be as satiated as someone who has fats in their diet. And it's also really important for hormone production in general, especially like steroid hormones, sex hormones. So like women, for example, we need fats to produce estrogen, and estrogen is another hormone that kind of like spot reduces belly fat. So people with higher estrogen tend to store fat in their subcutaneous tissues on their extremities, especially like that's why women tend to store fat in their hips and their thighs, whereas men tend to store it more in their belly. So you want to support your, sex hormone and steroid hormone production by incorporating dietary fats, especially if you're someone who runs a lot or eats a pretty low calorie diet, you're very active and you're pretty lean, and then that's especially important that you have some sort of dietary fat. It will, at least for me, I noticed a significant change in my energy level, my focus, my sleep when I started reintroducing dietary fats. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. 10-minute video. I noticed I have one more subscriber than last time. I don't know where they came from, because I've only made 2 videos, but thank you for subscribing. I don't know how consistent I'll be with these. I don't really have a plan other than to just talk about what I'm learning in medical school and like interesting stuff I'm learning in medical school that's like applicable to health and fitness, because that's what I'm interested in. So yeah, I don't like the idea of being like some famous influencer, but I love expressing like what I'm learning and my perspective on it. And I just sometimes feel like this is kind of sad, but I sometimes feel like people don't always want to listen to everything I'm learning. Like medical school is very dense. I don't think people are always interested in the minutia details of what we're learning, but I figured like if anybody is, then the best way to reach them is by sharing my journey online. I just hope it doesn't turn into this thing where I'm like scared to post because people have opinions and are bullies and things like that, because I'm a very sensitive person. I'm very sensitive to like criticism and things like that, not in the sense that I'll change or be someone I'm not to appease other people, but in the sense that I really take criticism to heart and think about like what I could do better or how I could use that criticism to improve as a person. But sometimes the problem is like I listen to criticism from people who I don't need to listen to or whose criticism came from a place of like misunderstanding or misinterpretation, and or who just are being needlessly mean. So yeah, I want to share what I'm learning, but I also don't want to deal with the consequences of that. So we'll see. We'll see how many videos I post and whether I actually keep them up or take them down. I'm not sure what will happen. Anyway, I hope you have a wonderful night and that you learned something from this video. Toodles.